everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Operational Innovations that Enhance Site Sponsor Collaboration. I'm Jordan Jensen with Cognizant Life Sciences Marketing, and I'll be the host for today's event. Let's cover a few housekeeping items before we begin. On your screen, there are multiple application engagement tools. You can resize them and move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. Please expand your media player area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. For the best viewing experience, we encourage closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background. This helps conserve your bandwidth. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there's no dial-in number. Make sure your computer speakers or headset are turned on and the volume is up so you can hear the presenters. Some networks cause video to lag, so logging off your VPN is recommended. If your video is behind, pushing F5 on your keyboard will refresh the page. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help Engagement tool at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to now introduce the members of our panel. Avi Kulkarni is Senior Vice President and leads Cognizant's Life Sciences Strategic Business Unit. He serves biopharma and medical device clients across R&D, commercial, and digital health. He is responsible for commercial development and planning and for the West Region P&L across all services, products, and platforms. Avi has been a leader in the industry for over 3 decades, building new drug formulations and diagnostic tests, conducting clinical studies, and publishing in personalized medicine. Heike Pryor is Global IT Business Partner, Trial Execution at Roche. She joined Roche in 2008 and has over 25 years of experience in IT leadership and consulting. Heike currently partners with Global Clinical Operations to co-create and deliver consolidated strategies aligned to customer and patient engagement strategic business objectives. She also leads various initiatives seeking to improve patient and investigator experiences and promotes patient-centric practices within Roche and beyond. Jimmy Bechtel is VP of Site Engagement at SCRS. He brings experience from both the site and sponsor sides of the clinical research industry. At SCRS, Jimmy is in charge of developing and executing the company's site-facing initiatives and works closely with key industry partners to build out various SCRS partnership programs. Additionally, Jimmy drives the implementation of the membership department's site-focused operations, as well as design and marketing. Nicholas Somalia is Clinical Research Collaborations Manager at MSK. He acts as the high-level main point of contact and relationship manager between MSK's Clinical Research Division and MSK's sponsor, CRO, vendor, and licensing partners. He has been in the role for almost 5 years and has been at MSK for 13 years. And now, I'd like to turn it over to our panel moderator, Avi Kulkarni. Welcome, Avi.
Thank you. I do appreciate the introduction. So, and then I'd also like to thank our panelists for joining this discussion today. By way of how I'll be conducting this session, I have a bunch of prepared questions which I'll be asking, and for the most part we'll go sequentially. But let's mix and match it also from time to time. So let's not have it be the kind of discussion where someone feels either compelled to speak or the other way around, has a burning point to make and has to wait to get their point out, right? So, like Nicholas and Jimmy, let's have some fun as we do this. I'd like to start with an opening statement, which is, before we even talk about innovations, let's talk about site sponsor collaboration and the incredible importance of the discussion we're having today. First, clinical trials are getting more globalized, right? No argument there. But the degree to which studies are being conducted globally, and especially outside North America, the statistics are quite significant, right? 47% in North America, 37% in Europe, 5% Middle East, and increasing also towards a more Asian bias. Sponsors, such as Heike's company, Roche, have to work closely with sites to understand regional nuances as they work with or define or interact with study protocols, and especially around whether or not inclusion-exclusion criteria can actually work within the context of a particular site and regional set of medical management protocols. And all of this within an objective, which is to limit the number of amendments so that the overall data set remains analyzable as a joint set. So that's one. Complexity. The protocol amendments have gone up and up over the last decade, such that today we have seen an industry that is, by imputed value, spending about $7 to $8 billion just in implementing the amendments of in clinical studies. And this is data from a Tufts study. And so clearly communicating as early as possible what's doable, factoring in the changes required, and minimizing amendments is really important and critical. A third force is the amount of information that is exchanged between sites and sponsors. We have data that suggests that in a phase 3 trial with over 200 sites over a 3-year period, one exchanges over 30,000 study documents. And by the time you do that and include the 100,000 safety notifications and then the invoices and payment and training exchanges, the number of documents very quickly get into well beyond just a simple terabyte kind of number, which sounds impressive until you realize that itself is just the beginning of a set of data and documents that will start overwhelming the system. I'm going to make one last point, and then I'm going to ask others to make an opening statement. And my last point is this: decentralized clinical trials. So while we've talked about sponsors and sites and somehow implied that this is a academic medical center, the old model, the CRO sponsor AMC, in fact, the move towards decentralization in all of its glory, right? Whether it is a full model of DTC, of decentralized clinical, right, DCT, pardon me, or whether it is elements of DCT that get absorbed into the sort of, let's call it the classic model of conducting a clinical study. There's been so much in the way of change. And it's not that the change per se is bad, but the resulting process management and technology shift has created some degree of confusion. And if not confusion, at least challenges in terms of training, new processes, new technology adoption. And all of this has to be standardized and made rote, because in the end, the data that we generate in a clinical study have to be of an absolute level of quality without any suspicions about protocol deviations or disconnect in the flow. And whenever you introduce a major seismic force like decentralized clinical trials, that can happen. So that's just why this is so important, to think about what the challenges are and then think about improvements. With that, if I may ask Heike for her opening statement, and then I'll go on from there to Nicholas and Jimmy. So Heike, you're next, please. Your thoughts?
Okay. Thanks, Avi. Thanks for inviting me to join in this discussion with other industry leaders, because that's quite close to my heart, as I've been working in that space for quite a while now. At Roche, we have many different initiatives on, and we have been thinking about this topic, how we improve site and sponsor collaboration. I just maybe want to share one personal example. I've been involved for the last more than 5 years now to try and build up the Transcelerate Shared Investigator platform, which is one of the probably lighthouse projects under an industry collaboration to address sponsor and site collaboration. And one of my learnings was that obviously it was much harder than anybody would have anticipated to really kind of get traction and make this stick. But one of the learnings was really that we have to really invest more effort to truly understand what increases burden at the site, what can we do to reduce burden and make this more site-centric, all the approaches we are doing. And that we have to keep at it, and that it's a journey. It's not done in one day, and we have to kind of just keep investing and keep understanding and learning and improving what we are doing with new technology approaches. So that's the one learning to get us going and to share that. And as I'm representing the informatics function at Roche, obviously my examples are more coming out of technology advances in the field. But then another kind of learning, or what we are emphasizing at Roche, is that it has to be also come with a mindset shift, that we are thinking more about sites as customers. So we're even referring to sites and investigators as customers now, and that we are trying to really put ourselves in their shoes when we are actually introducing new processes, new technology, so that we really see in all what we are doing, what's the impact to the sites and obviously eventually also to patients. So it's not just the technology we need to leverage, but also kind of this shift in thinking and become more site-centric in our approaches.
Thank you. I think we should almost definitely come back to this point, which is how has change management become such an important part of the overall arc of this story about operational improvements. But let's give Nicholas a chance for his opening statement, followed by Jimmy, and then let's come back to that point. Thank you. Nicholas? Nick?
Hi, thanks, Avi. Thanks for inviting me for the conversation. So I'm the Clinical Research Collaborations Manager at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And so fostering collaboration between MSK and our sponsor, CRO, vendor, and licensing partners is the focal point of my position. So you can imagine that I believe that site sponsor collaboration is critical because that is all I do. So without good collaboration efforts, it's very difficult to ensure the working relationship between sponsors and sites is as optimal as it can be. Heike mentioned she views sites as customers, but I actually also try to frame sponsors as the site's customers. I think if everyone views everyone else with this customer focused lens and customer service, I think everything works very well. I'll be framing my contribution to this discussion from the site's perspective, and specifically from a large academic site. I wanted to mention that just because some of my opinions come from, being a part of a large academic site and is not necessarily representative of the smaller sites. I'm also going to use my experience as a collaborations manager and a relationship manager to help frame my opinion on the topics and to answer the questions. I'm going to try to bring it more to a high level perspective than really, a day-to-day perspective.
Nicholas, that was a good point. And thank you, by the way, that was beautifully, I'll rephrase what you said, but I think the idea of having each constituent, each major constituent, see each other constituents in the system as also customers is such a collaborative way of looking at the ecosystem and the interactions that we need to have. So thank you. Again, something we'll pick up in a moment. Why don't we ask Jimmy for his opening statement, and then we'll take it from there. Jimmy, all yours.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you, Cognizant, for inviting me to be here. At the Society of Clinical Research Sites, SCRS, we represent the voice of the site holistically, right? So across our membership really is what we were designed as an organization to do. And that is specifically focusing on site sustainability. So I sit in a similar position as Nicholas, where I work very closely with our sites, but also with our sponsor, CRO, and service provider partners to try to find paths forward, all with the focus, of course, as I mentioned, on site sustainability long term. But I like a lot of what Nicholas and Heike said around putting yourself in the site's shoes and understanding where they're coming from and how we can better collaborate together in the future, but also kind of how it truly is. It has to be a two-way street, right? It has to be a little bit of give and take and understanding from each other's perspective. And I think as we'll talk about when we talk about things like communication, where that tends to start to break down a little bit and why that's such a challenge for what we see in the industry. So again, thank you for the invitation and excited to get started on the conversation.
Thank you, Jimmy. Let me frame a question that goes as follows. I mean, just let's articulate some of the problem issues around here, right? What do we see as the barriers to site-sponsor collaboration? Now, Heike alluded to one of them with the solution that she has sponsored through Roche at Transcelerate, and that's a technology solution. But there's more. So rather than me articulate them, let me, if I may, turn the mic over to Heike and say, what are the barriers to site-sponsor collaboration today? And do you see issues that hinder collaboration between site sponsors and, if appropriate, other constituents? Heike?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe let me still stay with the shared investigator platform example. I mean, we have gone out and really listened to the pain points sites were raising, try to kind of introduce this common platform. But what we are seeing now is that the platform itself is still used differently across the sponsor companies. And even if I look at our own organization, it's used differently from trial to trial. So that means although we have now a common platform, we don't still have a standard way of conducting processes and how we actually using these tools, which then obviously creates burden, training burden, additional maybe room for errors at the site level. So really the absence of kind of standard processes and the tooling to go with it, I think is still kind of an issue. That's maybe the first point I want to make. And what I'm also seeing is that it takes time to adopt new ways of working and new tools. And there's less and less time at the site, but also there's staff turnover we see in our organization, but also at the site level. So there's not enough time to really go through the change curve and really fully understand new ways of working, new tools. And so this is when then users get stuck very early on in the change curve and never kind of make it to the point that they really see the full benefit of what we are trying to offer and of changed ways of working, which I think is really an issue in kind of what we said earlier in the adoption and the change management we have to do. And last but not least, what has come up recently all the time is that obviously sites are investing heavily in their own tools and they have optimized their workflows internally. And now if we are coming with processes we are imposing from outside or additional tools that obviously don't fit in the ways of working, which then again increases the effort. But we have been starting to look into how can we integrate in those tools and integrate into the site workflows. But with the diversity of tools and processes, there is no easy way to get really traction there. So it would be really also interested to hear what the other participants think, whether we can really make an effort to kind of also integrate more in site processes and ways of working and tooling at the site.
Yep. And Heike, if I may, a follow-up question or thought. You've been working on like SIP for 5+ years. The COVID-19 related challenges are a short proportion of that, right? Just so from 2020 March onwards, so 2+ years. So you have a bigger timeline to think about. And then the Great Resignation that we've talked about is also more recent. The point you made about change management, the change curve, staffing level changes that result in retraining and making sure that folks are able to work within a consistent set of parameters of operations and operational mechanisms. Does that predate any of this, or has it been made worse in any way by these last 2 odd years of stress on the system?
I don't think it made it worse. I mean, there's more pressure, I guess, to get work done, and there are less people. Maybe also there are more people moving out of the health industry. Maybe that kind of is increasing, so that the problem is getting worse with training and adoption. I couldn't speak to whether this is really related to that, but yeah, I think it's a continuous challenge on all sides, on the sponsor side and on the investigator and site staff side.
Thank you. And then picking up on a point you made about how there are investments that especially the large sites must be making in site-specific systems. Maybe that's a perfect segue, to asking Nicholas this question, which is, at Memorial Sloan Kettering, do you find that you have made a whole set of decisions and implemented them with a whole set of technology platforms and widgets, and then sponsors or technology providers like Cognizant come to you representing sponsors and say, can you do it this way? Is that a zone of conflict, and how does that get resolved?
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's actually, on my list of things to discuss. So I think, yes. So to answer your question, yes, that has happened. But what we try to do is whenever we're implementing a process, we try to go, or I at least try to get sponsor input on the process and to try to tweak it before we roll it out. So if we're going to change, like, for example, if we're going to change how we're doing regulatory, if we're moving it to electronic, or if we're trying to automate it, or whatever the case may be, we will try to go to our sponsor partners and say, hey, are there any red flags here? Here's a draft SOP. Here's a draft standard working procedure. What does that look like to you? What issues are you going to have? And this is more from a high level, like, what are your study teams going to really have problems with? And we try to work that out at the beginning. And so I think that, the timely feedback of new processes, I think, is really important. And yes, to go back to your original question, I think we do, just because large academic sites have the ability to create their own processes, to create their own systems, and, if we're framing it in terms of the shared investigator platform, we did have a separate system that we have used, and that with wanting to use this shared investigator platform, it now became redundant. And so we had to work with the sponsors to figure out what's the best way to do that. And I think what's important here with these types of things is transparency. So along with the timely feedback of new processes, and if we're talking about the shared investigator platform, I think that's one of the things that was missed a little bit, was timely feedback from large academic sites. I think we've got the community-based centers, we've got smaller centers right at the beginning, which was great. But when it was time to roll it out to the large academic centers, the processes, it was very, very difficult. So I think that was one learning thing that we had. And now we have the AACI group, we have a lot of site collaboration. So I think that's, an excellent way to move forward. But along with that, I just think transparency is one of the barriers that we run into. Everyone is very nervous about how transparent they should be, what that looks like, and what the consequences of the transparency will be. And one of the things that we really, or I personally believe is more helpful, is to be more transparent than not. And, of course, there's always going to be, one-off instances where it doesn't benefit the site or it doesn't benefit the sponsor to be transparent. But I think for the most part, transparency really does help get both sides aligned.
Indeed. Hey, I know that the way I framed the question, it was just one deep dive for you, but it felt like you had other broad points you had also wanted to make about the top one or two or three barriers to site-sponsor collaboration today. Did I steer you too deep, too fast? Were there other points you wanted to make?
You got 2 of my 4, so you had a very good good question. The only other things I was going to bring up was just, we run into issues with discrepant SOPs and workflows. I feel like that brings us at a lot of barriers where the site will say, well, this is our SOP, we can't do it. The sponsor will say, well, this is our SOP, we can't do it. And we run into, issues there. And the other thing, and it's all, I'm only bringing this up because I find it's all very interrelated, is that both sites and sponsors haven't always prioritized the relationship. And to come up, and I think, and have an avenue for the transparency, have an avenue for the timely feedback. There's no way for both sides, or there haven't been always, to get that to the site, to get that to the sponsor. And I think we're getting much better at that now with, not to toot my own horn, but with positions like mine, but, most sponsors now have site relationship managers now. They have those avenues. So I think that has really been a barrier, just not having someone to go to give them the feedback, not knowing how to share that transparency.
Thank you. Hey, it occurred to me that a complaint I'd heard years back when I was starting my journey in clinical trials, so it goes back over many decades, was that the patient seemed to come last. And Jimmy, with our apologies for 20-something minutes in this conversation, having you always be third, let me, if I may, jump the queue and give you a double question. Feel free, please, to answer this question, that is the barriers to site-sponsor collaboration. But let's also, when you're done with that, go to the second question in our series, right? Which is, with what do you see as things that have actually worked well? So examples of where you've seen site sponsor collaboration or patient-led site sponsor collaboration actually improve some of the issues we've talked about. So Jimmy, all yours.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll briefly answer the first question because I found myself smiling as Nicholas was talking about how they take the time as an organization to analyze, and when they're implementing a new process, to go back to the sponsor or CRO and ask them, you know, are there any red flags? Is this going to work? Imagine if our sponsor and CRO partners did that for the sites. It happens, right? It does, and it's happening more and more frequently. But the earlier on, which kind of leads me into your second question here, some things that have worked well, we see that sponsors and CROs are starting to do this in a bit more frequency, right? They're going back to the sites. They're trying to give them as much lead time as they can, as far as what technologies they're using, what vendors they're going to have supplying the trial, different operational procedures. Because as you mentioned in our opening statement, Avi, the protocols continue to become more and more complex. We're trying to cram more into one document now than we ever have done before. And there's a lot of operational nuance there. So having these site sponsor relationship managers, as Nicholas mentioned, it is a critical step. And I think something that we have seen success in implementing, because these individuals are in it for the sites, right? And the patients, more importantly, they're there to make sure that the sites have what they need and listen to the sites to help try to bring that back and drive some internal change as they can, or get this information in front of the sites as soon as possible. It's a big thing we hear from our site partners, is that you can just give me this information sooner, so that I can budget for it and I can resource for it and I can understand how that's going to work. It will go a long way. But by the time the budget and contract is coming, then you hand me this long list of all these different technologies and vendors and everything that I'm going to use that are totally disparate from my operations. That's when we start to run into challenges, and especially when it comes to things like sustainability and trial timelines and getting patients on the study, or spending that time with them that we need to do. So again, emphasizing the point that the things are heading in the right direction when it comes to this over the last, we'll say, 5 to 10 years, the implementation of these new roles around site and patient partnerships, site patient and sponsor partnerships has been a huge positive step in the right direction.
In fact, if I may just have a follow-up there, one would imagine, because this has been a known problem for so long, that lots of things have been attempted at a specific tactical level or at a broad level. Just say something like, digital tools will have allowed for faster translation of and made more visible the protocol requirements into site-specific, let's say, technology tools requirements, which allows you a chance to sort of say, can I do this? Will this work for the site? Will this work for the patient? And so on. Are you actually seeing that, though? Are you seeing a positive trend line in that regard? So at least old problems are going away, and now we're dealing with new problems, or is it nothing seems to be still helping? What's the answer there?
I wouldn't say nothing. I would say things are being addressed in the right direction, but every time it seems that we start to get ahead of some of our challenges. I really did start to see this at the end of 2019. We're kind of getting out ahead of decentralized clinical trials specifically. We'll use that as an example. We're kind of started to identify it as a potential large scale new challenge and a new direction for our industry. And we were taking the steps collaboratively to try to make things happen in a positive way, kind of taking those necessary baby steps. But then 2020 happened, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But there are still a lot of lingering challenges that the sites face, and they've kind of been pushed down the list a little bit as a result of the tremendous amount of challenge that technology has brought to the site domain. But things around experiences around training, budget and contracting and financing, a lot of those challenges still exist. But they've just kind of taken a different shape a little bit as we've entered this massively digital world, and the implementation of the rapid implementation of a lot of new technologies. Again, all that to say is, yes, there's some of those problems that have stood the test of time still exist, but there's also new problems that continuously arise as this industry continues to try to rapidly innovate.
Thanks, Jimmy. Heike, let me turn this question over to you, which is, in the last 5 to 10 years, do you see specific examples of where some of these barriers and issues have been resolved?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there has been progress been made in different areas, but I think what I still want to also mention, I mean, the fact that these industry collaborations exist and organizations like the SDRS has enabled us to get closer to the sites and kind of understand what site needs are, but also to collaborate amongst sponsor companies to really kind of try to streamline some of the processes and tooling. And this did not exist before. And what was also great to see that there was a great openness also between sponsor companies to share what works well, and what that certainly also helped the fact that this is now possible through these kind of collaborative efforts. Mentioned in your introduction, I mean, what we have been working on at Roche for many years was actually to improve on distributing safety-related documentation. Yeah, and just to give you maybe also some figures, I mean, we are at the moment distributing, I think, a million documents a month for reporting on adverse events and safety. And this would not have been possible in a manual way. So we were investing over many years now in automating this process. And also very lately, we obviously had also the feedback, hey, we are spamming the sites with kind of this information. So we were working really diligently through kind of consolidating this and kind of now sending daily digests instead of a single email. So we're really working through this and we are listening. It's not just, hey, we are done, we have sent this out. So there was a lot of progress made in that area to overcome that. And I mean, in many other areas, we have also successfully used technology to improve processes. But what I wanted to say to the earlier statement, at the moment, the new tools are still kind of individual tools, and they are not connected. And this is why it comes across to the side as all individual solutions where you have to repeat, for example, the enrollment of a patient multiple times. And so this connectivity is still missing, although the individual tools exist, like an ePro solution, eConsent solution, but there's a lack of connectivity and of a streamlined approach also to make the data flow through these systems. So that's definitely still a big challenge which is ahead of us.
Heike, this is great. I am going to pick up on one of the things you said and then ask Nicholas this question, right? Which is, while we have seen, and I'll certainly take a Cognizant point of view to start off with, an amazing amount of investment in technologies to try and get ahead of the known challenges and some of the effects that come about, such as the point you made, Heike, about. So then you end up with this. The technology lets you manage a complex amount of data and large number of documents, and you share that information, and then the feedback you get from sites is, we feel as though we're being spammed. And by the way, I've also received that, hence the laugh. But then you correct for it as quickly as you can, right? So there's corrective mechanisms such as you provide daily digests. On the technology backbone side, of course, there's things that we had to deal with, like, how do you make sure the data are accessible fast, and the speed, which was slowed down by all of these data documents, was pushed back up by using best technology constructs of today. But from a Nicholas and site perspective, let's start with, how much of this rings true to you? Have you actually seen that? Or have you seen entirely different challenges that were solved and not yet the one of technology is helping with data and connectivity and document management?
So I do think that technology has helped quite a bit. And I think that's one of the great, I think, one of the great areas that we've improved on, and in terms of removing barriers. I think where a lot of the issues come up are each person's perspective on how the technology should be used, or shall I say, each site, the site or company, so the sponsor and the site, the perspective. So I think what we see a lot is that, the large academic sites will like to create the technology themselves. The sponsors will like to create the technology themselves, and then they bring it to the other, and the other doesn't necessarily want to use that type of technology because they want to develop it themselves. And so I think, something like, let's say, e-consent. I know a lot of sponsors are developing e-consent because they know that that is something that the sites are hungry for. But the issue, though, is it's very hard to use something like a sponsor-developed e-consent. Sometimes the IRB may not approve it. Sometimes it's hard to approve because if you're approving one sponsor's e-consent, you have to approve all the sponsors' e-consents, and then you have how many different versions of consents. So that's very difficult. But then if a site develops an e-consent, not all sponsors will necessarily want to use that. And so I think that's where I've noticed a lot of the drawbacks. But I have to say that the technology really has helped, like direct data transfer, e-consent, remote monitoring. All of those have been a great benefit.
It's good. You prompted a thought which I think we should just frame for everyone, which is really our third question. So let's call it question number 3, which is just like you were talking about. If I could figure out a way to like standardize e-consent in a way that actually works for all sites and all IRB variations, and maybe this is too much of a pipe dream, but along that line of thought, what might be your top 2, 3, 4, 5 operational innovations that you can just frame as I wish for the following? And since you were the last to speak, why don't you just continue, and then we'll ask Jimmy next and Heike last.
So, are we talking specifically about e-consent in terms of that,
I
or
thought
are
I'd
we
start with e-consent as one, but let's see if there's more. I'm sure there must be. So where do you see, if I could get the following things to work, my dream would be?
So I think one of the major things would be if we can have direct data transfer. So that would eliminate the need to enter data into the EDCs. We can have, since most sites, I don't want to say most sites, but a lot of sites have an electronic medical record now. We can transmit that information directly to the sponsor and eliminate the middleman of the data entry coordinator. That's a huge one. I think.
What's blocking it? Is it really connectivity? Is it quality control? Is it standardization of terminology? What are all the things that might be the impediments to this?
All of those. I think they all come up in various ways, but all of you've named them all. I do think it's each, the site's perspective, the sponsor's perspective of what needs to be QA'd, what's an appropriate way to do it, how to do it, the time and effort that it takes. Also, bringing in something new takes a long time for people to adapt to. And so I think it's just wrapping your mind around a new way of doing clinical trials.
Thank you. Just interest of time, let me, if I may, the same question. So Jimmy, if you wouldn't mind going with your top, 3 to 5 is good, but even if it's 1 or 2 operational innovations.
Yeah, I'll stick with 2 because they really do rise to the top with me. And we've mentioned it a little bit throughout the duration of this presentation. Systems integration is a huge one for us, right? Having things that are able to communicate with each other, API, the systems talk to each other, whatever type of language you want to use there. But allowing the data collected in certain places to be translatable across others. And Nicholas mentioned this, right? It's kind of that direct data entry is just one example of systems integration there. But these systems, even from the same sponsors, don't seem to be able to talk to each other, right? And having a little bit more integration on that end, so there's not extra double work done. There's simplicity of the work also simplicity of the work that's done would be huge. The other thing too is this concept of consolidation, right, of platforms and work. And I know SIP is definitely aimed at that. And while there's a lot of work to do left to make SIP, continuously a viable product for the ecosystem here, and things that need to be enhanced on it, it's absolutely a large step in the right direction. And concepts like the shared investigator platform that are, again, designed to consolidate a lot of this work into one repository that brings in all of these different components is huge. And we're seeing a lot of our technology companies that exist in this space doing a lot of this work. These big companies, right, that have either acquired or developed their own solutions that tackle different problems or different aspects of a clinical trial that they've brought into their piece of software, their platform, to try to solve this problem of consolidation and this pervasion of disparate systems that exists in this ecosystem. Thanks,
Jimmy. Jimmy, as you were talking about the shared investigator platform, I remembered a prior conversation I'd had with Heike, so I'll give her the phone in just the mic in just a moment. But among the things that she had said were what she'd like to have would be single sign-on, which is a feature that we have worked so hard to get into SIP. But obviously, as the front end, it works, but it doesn't yet work throughout the tech stack, so to speak. So with that cue, Heike, the mic is all yours for your top 2 or 3 operational innovations.
Yeah, I mean, single sign-on and the way we manage access to our system, because this keeps coming up as still a pain point for sites when we do surveys, and so that keeps coming up. It's not an innovation, so it's really embarrassing really to mention that, but it's kind of still a problem, because what I'm seeing, and we have tried to work through this, as you said, over the last couple of years, that the vendors we are using and trying to integrate on these common platforms, they just don't put enough focus and effort behind that. And as soon as you then venture out and kind of try to connect the ecosystem, dealing with different vendors, it just becomes very, very hard. And sometimes I wish that we as a sponsor, but maybe also the other players in the ecosystem, would just kind of make this a mandate and say, hey, if you can't integrate via single sign-on mechanisms, or if you don't have any open interfaces to the API topic, we're not using you anymore. Yeah? So just make this really, this is the standard, and really move away from digital solution providers mainly who are not adhering to these standards. So that would be really my wish for the future, and that we would come together as an industry and as ecosystem players to really define the standards we want to kind of push forward. That would be kind of my dream, so for the future.
Deviating from our script, so to speak, a bit, isn't that something that a cross-industry collaboration body like a Transcelerate could bring about to some extent? Roche plays there. Our other panelists are not part of the pharma collaboration, which is what Transcelerate is. But I guess the question I'm asking is, that's one way to think about it, but the other is to bring all the ecosystem partners into some kind of joint body where we could say, let's think of where these interoperability issues are, think of where the standards need to be, so that we could start defining them. I'm going to pause. Did I frame that question in a way that you can answer? If not, I'll make it more pointed.
I mean, there are other industry collaborations where also vendors, sites are present. It's just the way Transcelerate is set up, that it's only kind of the sponsor companies coming together there. But I have not seen really a lot of traction, although everybody speaks about that, that we need standards and that we need to drive it in that way. It just seems to be, this is not where the money currently goes, as we still kind of support that we can also have very siloed approaches. Then I think there's just, we can't break this cycle that we are still allowing this to happen.
Yep. Let me ask the same question of Jimmy and Nicholas. Nicholas, do you mind also picking up this theme, which is, what might it be that we could do better to understand and then bring about standardization? In essentially, this is a technology standardization, but you could broaden the question if you'd like.
I think it's actually kind of what Heike was saying is, I think actually it's hard for sites to agree upon standardization a lot of times, because each site operates so differently, depending on where they're located, the patient population, what type of institution they are, so on and so forth. That part has actually been, I think, with the shared investigator platform, I'm learning that, I think we've said we've wanted this, but then in actually trying to do it, it's been a lot harder because, a Memorial Sloan Kettering is not the same as a Duke, is not the same as a Sarah Cannon, is not the same as, New York Health and Hospitals Community Center. So it's much different than I think we all realize. And I think to help with that, it is bringing multiple sites together from all the different areas and locations, and same with the sponsors and all the collaborators. I think having that early engagement would really help with that and give that type of perspective. But, to be honest, I've just noticed that it is, from a site's perspective, it is pretty hard to standardize across that way.
Thank you. There's something here which if I have time near the end, I'm going to weave in, but let's go to our fourth question of the day, which is really around a historical point of friction between sites and sponsors, right? And I'm going to articulate it in a overly simplistic way, and that is that when a protocol is put together, there's the whole statistical calculation for how will you get enough data to be able to sort of prove the case, the power calculation, if you will. The power calculation is then spread across multiple sites, and that draft protocol is sent out with an expectation of, will you help me find patients, right? So again, overly simplifying this. But the problem statement often has been, it's all very well to do it in theory, but feasibility of sites is a continued issue of site performance to match the calculated feasibility, and performance in this case is not quality as much as just performance in terms of what patients actually made available in terms of actually being enrolled and then retained in a study. It continues to be an issue. And it sets up in my mind an interesting challenge, right? Because there's no bad actors in the system here. It's just an expectation versus what is the real performance. How can real performance be improved, right? So let's ask this question as, what improvements can sites and PIs make to make sure that the feasibility forecasts match patient recruitment and retention? And if I may, I'm going to start with you, Nicholas, with that question. Nicholas, I can't hear you.
I think.
Oh, thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thanks.
So I think one improvement is to go a little bit past the feasibility and go into the inclusion-exclusion criteria, because I find that when we've had issues recruiting, a lot of the times it's due to that inclusion-exclusion criteria. So we may have the patient population, but there's certain nuances of that inclusion-exclusion criteria that is limiting our ability to enroll. And I think being able to provide early feedback and being able to adapt. Sometimes, a sponsor may ask for developmental feedback on a protocol, but it may be too late, or it's, we have to do another amendment. We all know how costly and time-consuming amendments are. And so to make these adjustments, it's hard to do it in real time. So I think, having early engagement on that would be very helpful.
Let's ask Jimmy if he has the same perspective, something different. So Jimmy, what's your thought about this question?
Yeah, my perspective's a little bit different, actually. I feel that the burden here needs to be placed on the sponsors and the CROs. I understand the role that the sites play in this and how critical that role is and what needs to happen here, but it is the sponsors and the CROs who are ultimately submitting this data back to the FDA, right? And so it's the burden is on them to accurately understand where their sites need to be as far as enrollment goes. And they do a pretty good job of trying to adjust that with things around rescue sites, incredibly expensive rescue missions here on sites, the delays, and how much that costs them. So it behooves them on the orders of hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars to get this right from the beginning. And the best way I can see to do that is to talk to the sites. Again, we go back to the concept of involving the sites early on in these conversations and understanding from them, here's our protocol. Here's how we're going to ask you to operationalize this study. How does that work for you? How is it going to be enrolling patients for this study? That needs, if it could happen 100% of the time for every single protocol, go out to your top enrollers on that therapeutic area, right? Go out to the good guys. Go out to a variety of different sites, right? Don't just go to MSKCC and Sarah Cannon's and all these other large organizations. Go to the community-based sites too, where we see a lot of oncology research happening in today's day and age. Get the variety of opinion from a variety of sites. That's what you're paying these site and patient liaison partners to do, and get that feedback early on, because unfortunately we see time and time again, the individuals that are writing and designing these protocols are so many degrees separated from the research sites that they don't necessarily understand operationally how that's going to work for that site and whether or not, or even for the patient. We see that a lot in certain therapeutic areas in CNS and things like Alzheimer's and certain psychological disorders that it may sound good in theory, but when you ask a patient to come in and do X procedure or their caregiver to associate them with that, it's a tremendous challenge. It's gonna turn patients away, as an example, right? So having these conversations with the sites as to whether or not that's going to work and adjusting your protocols and your feasibility forecasts based on the information you get from them is going to go a long way in getting these as accurate as possible. That's right.
Hey, Jimmy, thank you. Now let's hear from the sponsor perspective. So Heike, do you have things that you agree with what Nicholas and Jimmy said, or are there points of disagreement?
Yeah, for sure. At Roche, we are acknowledging that we have to help with that. And I think a few years back now, we have mandated it actually to involve sites in protocol design and development for all our trials. So this is a standard procedure. What I cannot tell, remember, I'm representing informatics, is the variety of sites they're usually going to. I cannot comment on that, but it's for sure a standard approach. And on top of what I also want to call out, that we are also including patients now in protocol development, as I think Jimmy was saying. That's also a standard procedure to see whether this is also kind of fine for patients, whether they would actually be able to participate under the difficult circumstances. And what we also do, we are very mindful in trying to offer also patients additional services to make it easier for them to participate in trials, like reimbursement of expenses, of childcare. We are trying various efforts to increase retention once we have found the patients so that they stay on the trial. So there's quite a lot of things going on, and we do acknowledge that we have a role to play in that space for sure.
Heike, thank you. Everything you've said, that all three of you have said, makes sense. The only thing you didn't mention, which I'll just say to round out the picture, is this has become quite a cottage industry, right? There's, in addition to all the standardization and the communication and the improvements and all the tactical levers that you described, even Roche is engaging in, including compensation for travel and so on. The analytics part of it, there's a huge number of providers who've said, allow us to help you by doing pre-screening and looking at data and identifying sort of target-rich sites and seeing if the currently designed inclusion criteria may or may not work. So it feels like this is a industry-wide accepted problem where there's lots of solutions being tried. We can only hope that as time goes by, this will become less of an issue. It clearly is, even today, quite a significant challenge. As we wrap up today's discussion, I'm going to ask each of us to please speak for maybe a minute on a theme that's your genuine passion as part of your closing statement. So Heike, since you're on screen, may I ask, and the last person who last spoke, what might be your, if you remember nothing else, please remember this kind of statement.
Well, maybe to reiterate the collaboration between all stakeholders. I think this is key to the success. And so that we really get together the sites, the sponsors, the industry players, which providing a service and digital solutions to really better understand what works and what doesn't. And also, I mean, this evolves over time, yeah, but we thought what worked 2 years ago, this might changing. So we really have to constantly stay on top of that. And then the other thought I want to leave with is that we really have to drive standardization and interoperability of platforms. Obviously, I'm representing informatics, and without that, I think a lot of the solutions which are theoretically possible are just not practically possible that we can implement that, like the direct data transfers, I think Jimmy and Nicholas were talking about. So this is really something which needs to happen in the ecosystem to really move the needle for site and sponsor collaboration.
Thank you, Heike. Jimmy, if I can turn this over to you, and very quickly, since we are on a time-bound session here, what would you say is your closing statement?
Did you, Avi, did you prompt me? I apologize, I missed the name.
Indeed, Jimmy.
Okay, yeah, you know, it's tough to beat that, what Heike said. The collaboration and the communication emphasis is more important now than ever. And trying to have these conversations and involve the sites in the sponsor and CRO decision-making will go a long way for the success of the trials. We tend to operate as an industry in our silos. And you know, we have the sponsors and CROs and the industry partners and the sites and the patients all seem to be disparate and separate from each other. But if we can start to break down some of those pseudo barriers that we aren't even sure, I'm sure everyone here wonders why they even exist. I think we can go a long way with trying to improve some of these operational challenges.
Jimmy. And Nicholas, if I may, 30-second wrap up.
I agree with both of what they said, and I think also just I want to say, you know, just the prioritization of the relationship. I think the relationship between sponsors and the sites should be a focal point, and I think just that gaining of understanding of each, understanding how they work, being transparent, will take us, I think, a really long way.
Thank you. With my thanks for this engaging conversation, I'm going to turn the mic over to Jordan. Jordan, all yours.
Great. Thank you, Avi. That's all the time we have for today. On behalf of Cognizant, I'd like to thank all of our esteemed panelists, as well as our webinar attendees. We hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Cheers. Thanks.
Thank you.